Jewish Supreme Court. We're going to hit the final Jewish Supreme Court justices, people that you probably know and know a lot about, and they're quite interesting, quite important, and really are sort of tied in with modern Jewish identity. So the next Jewish appointment, we talked about Abe Fortas, and interestingly, for a period of about, so Fortas resigned in 1969, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg is the next Jewish appointee in 1993. In fact, yes, so there's no Jewish appointment until 1993. However, there is a Jewish nominee. Some of you news buffs or history buffs, which Jewish judge was nominated but ultimately withdrew his nomination before Ruth Bader Ginsburg? I'll give you a hint. He has the same last name as Ginsburg. Judge Douglas Ginsburg. So in 1987, President Reagan nominates what's the guy who was rejected?
Bork.
Robert Bork. The nominee is rejected, and then Reagan's next nominee is Judge Douglas Ginsburg, who is a pretty well-respected judge on the Washington Court of Appeals, and it's expected that his nomination is going to go well. But then it's discovered that while a professor at law school, he smoked marijuana. Now today, probably, almost certainly, that wouldn't be an issue one bit. It would be fine. But at that time, it was a tremendous issue, and Reagan didn't want to be known as the guy who, appointed the pot-smoking Supreme Court justice. So ultimately, after a big backlash, Ginsburg withdrew his name from consideration. Interestingly enough, he continued to serve as a judge on the Washington Court of Appeals until 2011. So he had a very distinguished career, but that career was not to include the Supreme Court. So in 1993, let's see exactly, let me find the date. On March 3rd, 1993, just 6 weeks after his inauguration, President Clinton had the opportunity to appoint a replacement for Justice Byron White, who had been there for 31 years. And he had been appointed by, I believe, Lyndon Johnson. So, is that right?
Jack Kennedy appointed him.
Oh, Kennedy appointed. Okay. Yeah. So Byron White retired. And so Clinton has to come with a Supreme Court appointment. Now, interestingly, he develops a list. Funny enough, who's the prime? There are two people who are primarily responsible for creating the list of potential nominees. One of them is White House counsel Bernard Nussbaum. The second is Ron Klain, who is now the chief of staff to President Biden, very powerful individual. But at that time, Ron Klain was the deputy White House counsel. So he was one of the key people composing the list of potential nominees. And there were several political nominees. So one of them was Mario Cuomo. One of them was Senator George Mitchell. One of them was Bruce Babbitt. Cuomo was sort of the lead contender, and Bill Clinton wanted him. Maybe Bill Clinton might have wanted Cuomo because he didn't want Cuomo as a potential political threat. That's another, but Cuomo ultimately turns it down. He says he doesn't want to stop being governor. So then Clinton looks at potential judges, and one of the top picks is Stephen Breyer, comes later. But Breyer's biggest champion is Senator Ted Kennedy. But Breyer meets with Clinton right after he had suffered a terrible biking accident. So he went right from the hospital to a meeting in the White House where the doctor didn't want him to go, and they didn't click. From what I read, they just, Clinton found Breyer to be aloof and uninteresting. So he said, I'm not going to nominate him. And so then he turns to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Let me give a little background. Many of you probably know some of her background, but Ginsburg has lived an extraordinary life. She grew up in Brooklyn. She went to James Madison High School, which is where a lot of, that high school has had a lot of famous people that went to it. Bernie Sanders went to James Madison High School. Chuck Schumer went to James Madison High School. Carole King went to James Madison High School. So anyways, she goes there. She's an excellent student, and she ends up, she's editor of the newspaper. She goes to a Jewish camp in the Adirondacks and is the camp rabbi for several summers. And she is accepted at Cornell. She goes to Cornell, is an outstanding student, and she's her class's top female graduate. There she met a guy who was a year ahead of her, Martin Ginsburg, and they got married right after graduation. In fact, the rabbi who officiated their wedding was Rabbi Robert Gordis, who you may remember I quoted in one of my High Holy Day sermons. He was a very, very intellectual conservative rabbi. And then she is accepted at Harvard Law School right after Cornell. She is one of 9 women in a class of 500. Isn't that amazing? Class of 500. So this is 1954. Yeah, 1954. Now, her husband was also at Harvard Law School. He was a year ahead. And so she's a year behind, 9 out of 500. And this was just a few years after the elite law schools started admitting women. And many of them didn't want to. They were kind of publicly pressured to do so. And interestingly, women were not permitted to live in the dormitories, the law school dormitories, or study in the Lamont Library rooms. Also, there were no women's bathrooms in one of the 2 buildings in which they attended classes. Isn't that crazy? Okay, so, but she goes, she persists. She is the first female member of the Harvard Law Review, which of course these are prestigious posts. So she's on the Law Review, again, an excellent student. Her husband graduates a year ahead of her and takes a job in New York at a big law firm. She transfers to Columbia Law School so that they can be together, and she finishes law school at Columbia, where she's only one of 12 female students, and she is also elected to the Columbia Law Review and is number 2 in her class. So pretty impressive. But with all of this, she is not hired as a Supreme Court law clerk. And as you might remember, Felix Frankfurter turned her down. She applied to be a clerk for Felix Frankfurter. He said no. He didn't even interview her because she was pushed by another one of his clerks. Another one of his clerks said, you should hire her, but he wouldn't even interview her, which is kind of sad because he was the first, Frankfurter was the first justice to hire an African-American clerk, but he couldn't hire a woman. Not interesting. So what does she do? It's hard, not a single New York law firm offered her a position. You know, they were barely offering Jews positions. They had started offering Jews, these prestigious New York firms had started offering Jews jobs, but a female and a Jew, no, too much. Ultimately, she's able to get a clerkship with a federal judge in New York, which works out. And then she gets a job as a faculty member at Rutgers Law School, where she's just an excellent, she is an excellent teacher, spends 1 year as a visiting professor at Harvard. And then in 1972, she becomes the first tenured female professor at Columbia Law School. Very, very prestigious. And while she's at Rutgers and Columbia, she does an enormous amount of legal work around women's rights advocacy. So she's the top attorney throughout the 1970s for the Women's Rights Project, which works to end sex discrimination in jobs. She kind of sees herself, and other people see her, as sort of the Thurgood Marshall of the female women's law. And perhaps her most important case was a Supreme Court victory in a case called Reed versus Reed, in which she wrote the ACLU's key legal brief, where the court unanimously overturned an Idaho state law that gave legal preference to men over women as administrators of estates of the deceased. And that was the first time that the Supreme Court struck down a law it struck down legislation on grounds that it constitutionally discriminated against women. So it's a very important precedent in that now this law, or the Supreme Court, is seeing gender discrimination as a category worthy of striking down democratically passed laws. So this is a tremendously important precedent. So in fact, Ginsburg, as attorney for the Women's Rights Project, argued 6 gender discrimination before the Supreme Court. Ginsburg sought to achieve legal recognition of women's rights by persuading the court's members that any form of sex-based discrimination was unconstitutional. She won 5 out of those 6 cases. Wow. I mean, that's tremendous. I mean, Supreme Court, you're the best of attorneys, and here she wins 5 out of 6 cases. In 1980, she was appointed by President Carter to the U.S. District Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. Wow, I didn't realize this. At that time in 1980, there were only 8 women federal judges. Believe that? And there are thousands and thousands of federal judges, I think. I assume it's in the thousands. And there's only 8 women. So she moves to Washington, D.C., and her husband takes a job as a professor at Georgetown Law School. It's interesting. She, as a judge, she's quite liberal on issues of civil rights and civil liberties, but she's also relatively conservative on criminal law issues. She's pretty law and order, which was not the case with all more liberal judges. And in fact, as a judge, it's the first time she actually spoke out, saying she criticized Roe versus Wade. She didn't say it should be overturned, but she said that it wasn't, she said there's a right to abortion, but that the way it had been decided was not proper, that it was almost too fast, that the Supreme Court moved to overturn a law that had been there for many, many years. And that here's that she affirmed the constitutional right to the surprise of some liberal and feminist supporters. She voiced public criticism of Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court's landmark 1973 decision that affirmed a constitutional right to abortion, because the court did not ground its decision in the Equal Protection Clause's guarantee against sex discrimination. Although she privately defended a woman's right to abortion on equality grounds, when she was nominated for the Supreme Court in 1993, some women's groups opposed her appointment because she had earlier expressed criticisms of the court's Roe v. Wade ruling. Interesting. I think so. She simply was saying it was not decided using the right legal reasoning, which actually there are a lot of other very respected liberal law professors who agreed with that it was not, that the decision may have been right, but the reasoning behind it was not. And then when the legal reasoning is not right, that opens it up to being overturned, which obviously happened this past year. So anyways, interestingly, as an appeals court judge, she is relatively she's moderate. She's liberal in many ways, but she also is kind of aware of her Judaism. Two interesting cases involving Jewish life. One is a case where a Orthodox Jewish Air Force officer named Simcha Goldman wore a yarmulke while at his Air Force base, at the Air Force Hospital. And his supervisor said, sorry, you can't do that. You can't wear head coverings indoors. And he sued. He was a clinical psychologist working at Air Force Base. While outdoors, he wore the regulation Air Force cap. When indoors, he wore a small yarmulke. In May 1981, Goldman's superior officer notified him that wearing a yarmulke indoors while in uniform violated the Air Force dress code and ordered him to remove it or face a court-martial. He refused, and Ginsburg dissented. That the majority upheld the Air Force's law, the Air Force's ruling. Ginsburg argued in her dissent that for a military commander to prohibit the yarmulke that Goldman had worn without incident through several years of military service reflected callous indifference to Dr. Goldman's religious faith and runs counter to the best of our traditions. So she kind of stood up for her right to express one's religious identity. She also, interestingly, there was a spy for Israel named Jonathan Pollard. Jonathan Pollard was spying for Israel. He was thrown in prison for a long time. He was ultimately pardoned by, I think it was President Trump. But he appealed. He withdrew his guilty plea, but then he was still convicted. I don't quite understand exactly what happened, but in any case, she was part of a 2-to-1 decision to convict Pollard. And the other, it was interesting, she voted to convict Pollard, and the other Jewish member of the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals, Lawrence Silberman, who is a conservative Republican, also voted to convict Pollard. So the most liberal member and the most conservative member, both Jewish, voted to convict an Israeli spy. So kind of interesting. Many Jewish groups tried to get Pollard released. Even the Reform movement, even more liberal groups saying that his sentence was too draconian for what he did. In any case, so she is a successful, respected judge on the DC Court of Appeals. In 1993, President Clinton has the opportunity to nominate somebody. There are several other Jews in sort of the potential nominee. One of them is Lawrence Tribe, who is a professor at Harvard Law School. But another Stephen Breyer. Ginsburg and Breyer, or Clinton and Breyer don't click. But Clinton clicks with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So he nominates her, and then tremendously, it's really, really remarkable, her nomination sails through. She is I think it's an 18-0 vote in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and a pretty almost unanimous vote in the let me get the exact statistics here. I had it up here. Okay. Yeah, let me find the exact numbers. It's pretty amazing. This doesn't happen anymore. Yeah, Ginsburg 18-0 in the Judiciary Committee, which never happens anymore. And the Senate vote was 97-3. And on August 10th, 1993, she took the oath of office as 107th Justice, the second woman. So first Jewish woman, first woman was Sandra Day O'Connor, of course. And she's obviously had a remarkable career on the court, and was really, kind of a symbol for many women, especially Jewish women, of equality and of and of a certain outlook. She was in many ways she was probably the most relatable Jewish member of the Supreme Court, you know? And the reason I say that, you know what, let's do Stephen Breyer, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit more about Ginsburg. So Breyer is a very interesting Jew. He, unlike all the other Jewish Supreme Court justices, Breyer grows up Reform. He grows up upper middle class Reform in San Francisco. His family are members of Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco, which is a beautiful sort of classical Reform synagogue in a beautiful part of San Francisco, wonderful dome building. If you're ever there, you should definitely visit it. So his family are members there. He has his bar mitzvah there, but he's more of a kind of typical Reform sort of secular Jew than everyone else. I mean, Ginsburg had grown up more conservative. All the other some grow up with nothing, but it's still a time of discrimination. Breyer grows up in relatively normal times. His mom is involved with Democratic politics. His father went to Stanford and was an attorney for the San Francisco Board of Education. So he is brilliant. He goes to Lowell High School, which is like the top public school in San Francisco. He's on the debate team, and one of his opponents that he debates a lot is Jerry Brown, who ultimately becomes governor. He's accepted at Harvard and Stanford, but chooses to go to Stanford because it's closer. And after Stanford, he wins a Marshall Scholarship to Oxford. So he's very, very smart guy. He goes to Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, just like many of our other Supreme Court nominees. And then he clerks for Arthur Goldberg. And in fact, he wrote one of the drafts of Goldberg's opinion in the very famous Supreme Court case Griswold versus Connecticut, which was the one that affirmed a right to privacy. And the right to privacy is what ultimately allows for Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade is decided on the basis of this case. After clerking, Breyer stays in DC and works for the Justice Department. And it's interesting, there he meets his future wife. And Justice Breyer's wife is from British aristocracy. His wife is Joanna Hare, a fellow Oxford graduate, and the daughter of Lord John Hare, the first Viscount Blakenham, a British aristocrat and politician who had served as a cabinet minister under Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and is chairman of England's Conservative Party. So this is a very sort of distinguished, very wealthy British family. And in 1967, the couple were married at a small village church in Suffolk, England, in an Anglican ceremony that was carefully edited to omit any references to Jesus. Interesting. Now, by the way, I found this out. Justice Breyer's daughter is an Episcopal minister. Isn't that interesting? So her father's obviously, he never converted. He's Jewish, but she was raised essentially Episcopal. But she doesn't work as a minister in a church. She's the head of a New York interfaith community group. So, and she's sort of an epitome of interfaith. She's obviously identifies as Episcopal, but she has this strong Jewish heritage. Breyer stays in Washington for a couple of years, but then ultimately goes to Harvard Law School, where he teaches, and he's an expert in regulation. He's really in government regulatory laws. And while at Harvard, he's frequently going back and forth to Washington, D.C., consulting with the Senate Judiciary Committee. He works on the Watergate prosecution team. He was an assistant prosecutor. Then he's chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that's where he gets very close with Senator Ted Kennedy, because Kennedy was the chair. But while working in Washington, he really crafts the airline deregulation laws. So essentially, all the airlines had basically had the same pricing and so forth. But in the 1978, there was a massive airline deregulation, and he wrote the laws for it. And this is where he was actually became very bipartisan. So the airline deregulation laws were sponsored by Senator Strom Thurmond and Ted Kennedy. And Breyer was the liaison. Breyer worked with both of them and their staffs to write these laws. And then essentially Breyer then worked on deregulation for trucking and natural gas. And he gained a lot of bipartisan support and friendship doing this work. So then in 1980, he was nominated by President Carter for a seat on the US Court of Appeals in Boston. The nomination is taken up after Carter has lost, and the Senate and the Congress, the Senate has already turned over. The Senate, mid-November, when Breyer's confirmation hearings began before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1980, Ronald Reagan had already been elected president, and Strom Thurmond had replaced Ted Kennedy as Judiciary Committee chair. So this was essentially very similar to what happened with Merrick Garland, although that was Supreme Court, this is Court of Appeals. But because of his experience doing bipartisan legislation, the Republican Senate and Judiciary Committee confirms Breyer, and he is the last federal judge to be confirmed before President Carter leaves office. And so he sits on that Court of Appeals for 14 years, and he's notable in that he helped craft U.S. sentencing guidelines to minimize disparities in criminal sentencing for comparable crimes. So there was a lot of speculation that certain crimes that tended to involve Black kids had more severe penalties than similar drug crimes with white kids. And he was part of the federal sentencing commission that changed the guidelines. He also writes books. He was just a tremendously productive judge. So he doesn't click with Clinton, obviously, for the first time, but then got a little lump in my throat here. When Clinton has another opportunity to nominate somebody, Kennedy, who was it that retired? Oh, yes. Okay. Harry Blackmun retires in April 1994. And Clinton wants to appoint George Mitchell. Mitchell is not interested. And so Ted Kennedy again starts pushing Clinton to nominate Breyer. And one of the ways he convinces him is he'll get bipartisan support. And in fact, Orrin Hatch also calls Clinton and says, you should nominate Breyer. So Breyer's nominated. He's confirmed 87-9 as a principal moderate pragmatist and becomes the 7th justice to serve on the Supreme Court. And interestingly, for the first time since the 1930s, 2 Jewish justices were serving together. The 1930s, it was Brandeis and Frankfurter. And now it was Breyer and Ginsburg. They're later joined by Ilana Kagan. But before we get to some of their decisions, questions, comments, concerns, anything?
I think Robert said that Justice Breyer was his best friend on the court.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Breyer, I've listened to some interviews with him. He was very procedural and intellectual. So Breyer, if you listen to him speak, he's not an ideologue. He's not somebody who has an idea of the decision he wants to reach and then gets there. He's someone who's very procedural and goes through, what does the regulation say? who's got the authority. And that's somewhat how Roberts is. Roberts may be perhaps a bit more ideological, but it seems like Breyer was more interested in the process. A lot of cases don't make it because someone doesn't have standing, to bring a lawsuit, and that's a procedural matter. What interest do you have in this? You can't just sue somebody for any reason. I mean, I guess you can, but it gets thrown out. You have to have some sort of standing, and Breyer has that procedural focus, and he is very pragmatic. He doesn't always. I mean, he's an interesting justice. He doesn't always side with the liberals. Other questions? It's one thing that's interesting, and I think that we see reflected now by the 1990s, is the decline in anti-Semitism in the legal profession. With all the earlier Supreme Court justices we saw, there was still marked anti-Semitism in sort of elite legal circles. But by the time we get to the 1990s, that's really disappeared. It's interesting. In 1951, Yale Law School appointed its first Jewish dean, but then it's kind of quiet for a while. But by in the 1970s, in 1970, you have Edward Levy, who's appointed president of the University of Chicago, and then the first Jewish attorney general. And by the 1980s, there are Jewish law school deans at Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Berkeley, and Penn. All have Jewish deans. Isn't that amazing? In 1969, you had the first Jewish president of the American Bar Association, Bernard Siegel. So remember, in the 1940s and 1950s, a lot of these elite law firms did not hire any Jews because, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, they didn't click with clients. But by the 1960s, there is much more hiring of Jewish associates. And in fact, there are even start to be Jewish partners in the 1950s. Not many, but a few. And what I found out, this was quite interesting. In 1971, you have the first Orthodox female partner at a prestigious law firm called Davis, Polk, and Wardell. And a Orthodox Jewish woman becomes a partner in 1971. That didn't happen very often. Still doesn't happen very often. But the point is that the legal profession has changed. And in fact, we saw that here in Chicago, that certain law firms that really didn't have very many Jews started having major Jewish partners like Kirkland and Ellis or Sidley and Austin, these very large, well-regarded firms. And the idea that there was a Jewish firm and a non-Jewish firm, which existed for a long time, those start to break down. And I think we see that in Supreme Court justices as well. So what happens when they're on the court? What happens with, let me open up my notes here. What happens with the Supreme Court and our Jewish members? So actually, before we do that, I might as well, I want to talk a little bit about Ilana Kagan because she's the most recent Jewish Supreme Court justice. And like Breyer, she is born into a relatively assimilated family in the Upper West Side of New York. Her father is a real estate lawyer. And she like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she is a top high school student, and she's the student government president at her school. And she wants to be a Supreme Court justice. Her high school yearbook photo, she is wearing a judicial robe. And it's interesting. But they were somewhat assimilated, but her parents actually also belonged to a modern Orthodox synagogue. They weren't observant, but they lived near this modern Orthodox synagogue, which was sort of kind of doing a lot of outreach at the time. And she wanted to have a bat mitzvah. And the rabbi said no, but they did do a ceremony in which she read certain prayers as part of the service. The rabbi had not ever officiated at any bat mitzvah, but she wasn't allowed to read from the Torah, but she gave a talk on a Friday evening Shabbat service. It's interesting. It's very interesting. After high school, she goes to Princeton. She works for the newspaper, and she then, like several of her predecessors, she studies at Oxford for a couple years, and then begins her law school at Harvard 5 years before President Obama went there. But like Obama, she was a assistant to Lawrence Tribe, the professor, and she's a spectacular student. And she, after graduating from law school, which is when 1986, she is a clerk for Abner Mikva, Chicagoan, who at that time was a judge on the Court of Appeals in DC. And then after her clerkship with Judge Mikva, she has a clerkship with Thurgood Marshall, who nicknamed the 5'3" Kagan Shorty. She works for a couple years at a Washington law firm. Then she goes to teach at the University of Chicago Law School, and she gets tenure. But then, even though she's a tenure professor at law school, by that time, her old boss, Ab Mikva, is chief counsel to President Clinton, and he asked her to come be his deputy. So she goes and works in the White House. And basically, she is very successful. She quickly won the respect of Clinton, who would say that anytime Kagan entered the Oval Office, the room's average IQ doubled. So she helped with the big settlement with all the tobacco companies in the late 1990s. She helped create that settlement and pass the legislation that legitimized it. And that was a huge federal settlement. So evidently this was a very impressive victory that sort of got her the attention of a lot of people and the respect of a lot of people. In 1999, she is nominated for the DC Court of Appeals, but her nomination is delayed because the Republicans control the Senate Judiciary Committee. And then ultimately, President Clinton has to let it lapse. And then John Roberts is ultimately appointed to fill the seat that would have gone to Kagan. She went back to University of Chicago Law School, but she wanted to go back to University of Chicago Law School, but they wouldn't let her back because she had been gone for too long and she hadn't published enough as a legal scholar. So they did not permit her to come back. Isn't that interesting? The U of C. So she was able to secure a visiting professorship at Harvard Law School, and then she was granted tenure at Harvard Law School. And Larry Summers, who she had worked with at the White House, appointed her the first female Harvard Law School dean. So there had already been Jewish deans, but she was the first female dean, female Jewish dean. No, first female period, excuse me. She was an excellent dean. She helped balance, there was a lot of ideological fighting between liberal faculty and conservative faculty. And she actually helped bring in both conservative and liberal faculty members. So this was a great skill. And then again, like Breyer, she was not an ideologue. She was not somebody who said it's my way or the highway. She was somebody who tried to balance all the different interests. She was popular among students, and she was sort of just a good leader. I saw Brenda ask, was Abner Mikva ever considered for the Supreme Court? Yes, he was. Yes, he was. But it was by the time he was already pretty old, and he was more of a politician than a judge. I mean, he was respected as a judge, but he had always been more in the political arena. And he kind of was just didn't fit the profile. His timing wasn't right. You know, a lot of these things, the timing, you have to be in the right place at the right time. His daughter is a judge, though, in Cook County, Judge Mary Mikva. I've met her many times. In fact, her son is a great kid. Her son is named Jordan Cohn, and he was in one of my first confirmation classes when I was an assistant rabbi. Her husband is a guy named Steve Cohn, so that's why I have Jordan Cohn. But I've seen her around at various things. She's an excellent judge, very respected. And Judge Mikva, the father, Ab Mikva's other daughter, is a rabbi, Rachel Mikva. She's a rabbi. She doesn't work at a pulpit. She is a professor at Chicago Theological Seminary, which is a Christian seminary, but it's very liberal kind of. And she teaches Judaic studies. She teaches Hebrew Bible. She's wonderful. She's a really top-notch scholar. So again, very distinguished family. As dean, she's very successful, and she is when Larry Summers is kind of pushed out as president of Harvard in 2006. She was the number 2 candidate to replace him, but she didn't get it. A different Drew Faust got it. But she had met President Obama when she was a lecturer at University of Chicago. When they both were at University of Chicago together. When he was there, she was also a lecturer, and they became friends. In fact, Mikva was one of their shared mentors because he was a mentor to Obama. And so they became friends. And when Obama is, when he is elected president, this is one of his first appointments. But they had a relationship prior to that. But in 2008, when he ran, she was very supportive, and in fact helped out a lot during the campaign. He nominated her to be the Solicitor General in January 2009. And oftentimes the Solicitor General is a stepping stone to the Supreme Court, because the Solicitor General is the one who argues the administration's cases before the Supreme Court. And so on March 19th, Kagan became the first woman and third Jewish Solicitor General in U.S. history. Wow, that's so she. It's interesting that she had very little courtroom experience, and yet she has this position. As Solicitor General, she argued a very important case in 2009 called Citizens United, which actually she lost on a 5-4 decision, where that was the case in which the court was asked to decide whether it was unconstitutional under the First Amendment to limit corporate free speech in the form of campaign contributions during election campaigns. In other words, can corporations give unlimited amounts of money to election campaigns? And the Obama administration said that corporations don't have the same First Amendment rights to free speech as individuals do. An individual can give an unlimited amount of money to any political campaign. Look at Michael Bloomberg. Gave $500 million to himself, to his own campaign. A wealthy individual can give whatever they want, because giving money is considered an expression of free speech. Makes sense. Obviously, probably not a great law, but it is constitutionally defensible, because if you you can spend your money however you want to spend it. But can a corporation do the same thing? That seems a little less clear. But the Supreme Court ruled against Kagan that corporations did indeed have these rights, and that corporations such as Citizens United, a conservative nonprofit group, enjoyed a First Amendment right to spend unlimited money to support the election or defeat of political candidates. Justice Anthony Kennedy, speaking for the court's majority, thus ruled that corporate speech in the form of election campaign contributions could not be limited. This exploded the use of money in politics, by the way. I mean, this Citizens United in 2009, I mean, the amount of money spent on political campaigns since then has just skyrocketed. This was a setback for campaign finance reform in general. But then, even though she lost that major case, on May 10th, 2010, Obama nominated Kagan to the Supreme Court to succeed Justice John Paul Stevens, who had announced he would be retiring that summer. She is confirmed, very interestingly, she is confirmed 63-47. She's funny. She's got a great sense of humor. Perhaps the best remembered moment of her confirmation hearings came when Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, while questioning Kagan about her views on the war on terrorism, asked where she had been the previous Christmas Day when a suspected terrorist attempted to blow up a Northwest Airlines flight en route to Detroit. She replied to uproarious laughter, "You know, like all Jews, I was probably at a Chinese restaurant." So she's got a great sense of humor, and she is successfully appointed. It's closer than others, but it's still not clearly not unanimous. She's also the youngest justice. She was only 50 years old when she was appointed. So then, when she is appointed, there are 3 Jewish Supreme Court justices, which is remarkable. Okay, I think this is a good place to pause. Questions, concerns? What do you make of this incredible sort of gathering of Jews on the Supreme Court? Yeah.
What's also interesting is, I don't remember what year it happened, but Antonin Scalia said to one of Obama's top aides sometime early in his administration that she would be a great pick for the court.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that. Scalia is, Scalia and Ginsburg had a very famous close friendship. I mean, they were each other's best friends on the court. They went to opera together. They lunched together. They were friends. Scalia is quite an interesting figure. Yeah, Sue.
Well, to talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg for a minute, as much as I so admire the woman for all her accomplishments and her brilliance, the one place that I think she really failed was by not resigning from the Supreme Court when she should have.
Yeah.
And it speaks to me that she had a huge ego and thought a lot of herself, even to the point that she thought she was immortal. Because
I think you're right. Yeah.
She had cancer a number of times. Her health was failing. Even though her mind was still very sharp, she knew about the partisanship in this country. And she knew that Mitch McConnell was a game player and that he would play tricks, which he ultimately did. She should have resigned.
I would add
well before she died.
When Obama was reelected, the Democrats still controlled the Senate another 2 years. So there was a 2-year period where she could have resigned after 20 years on the board, also being a cancer survivor. And Obama could have filled her seat before the Senate flipped a couple years later.
Right. And she absolutely should have. I think that, to me, just, I don't know, as much as I respect everything else, until then, I think she fell.
Yeah, maybe she felt, yeah, I mean, that's a very there's been a lot of interesting debates about that. And I think there's a lot of people that feel the same way. It's hard to say, you know, did she feel she was immortal, or did she simply think she would retire when it was appropriate for her to retire, and she tried to separate herself from politics? We don't know. It's very interesting. Diane, go ahead.
Although it's a great disappointment to me too, that the way it worked out, in defense of her, I would say that not one of us here probably thought that Trump would be reelected. And we could actually add Trump to our group. He didn't think so either. So I don't think it was ego so much as that she thought she had the time with a Democratic president in Congress. I think if she had any inkling that the nomination would fall to a Republican, she would have retired. And I don't know, was there anyone here who thought that Trump was going to win?
Yeah, good point.
I don't think so. I remember going to bed the night before.
Well, that's my little defense of her.
Yeah. It's a very, somebody posted this on one of the rabbinic Facebook groups that I'm in about Ginsburg, and somebody kind of made the similar argument, Sue, to what you said. And it's interesting, there was a lot of pushback, especially from female rabbis who said, how dare you, say anything negative, and it's personal choice, but I think part of the reality, which I think you're pointing out, is the judiciary is political. It is. There's no way of escaping that. Now, it shouldn't make decisions on a political basis. Of course not. I think we would all agree, but the nature of how people get on the court is political, and it always has been. This is not like this is an abnormality in American history. It always has been. It's perhaps more so now, but that is what Ginsburg was encountering, and it definitely, looking at the grand scheme of history, it was a miscalculation. A lot of that could be an interesting class in and of itself. Miscalculations in history. I mean, one of the most famous miscalculations just comes to mind. In Israel, how the ultra-Orthodox have so much power and they don't have to serve in the military? That was an accident of history. When David Ben-Gurion crafted a law exempting the ultra-Orthodox from military service, there were only 400 ultra-Orthodox Jews in all of Israel. And he basically said, they're dying out. They're never going to be anyway. So might as well just get this compromise so we can get it off the table. He had no inkling of what would happen. Obviously, it's a tremendous tension now in Israel, as we see in the government. So anyways, okay, this has been a wonderful discussion. And, we only have one now, a Jewish member of the Supreme Court, but there was sort of a golden period in which there were three. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week, and I will see you next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
See you
you.
next time.